welcome folks, welcome to today's webinar. This is our monthly webinar series. The topic today is responsive web design. You've all, I'm sure, heard of the term responsive design lately. This is a way of making your application deliver or show effectively on a variety of display devices, including smartphone, tablet, or desktop. So what we'll do in this webinar is we'll dig a little deeper to really understand this concept of responsive web design and discuss ways to effectively and efficiently deliver it in your environments. And I'll introduce the speaker in a minute, but before I get to that, let me just make sure we cover the logistics, which is similar to what we do every month in these webinars. We'll have roughly 45 minutes or so of presentation that we'll go through to cover this topic. And we'll take some questions along the way as they need to be taken. And then I'll still reserve some time for towards the end, 15 minutes or so, to take general questions at the end. And you are welcome to send in your questions on your Q&A panel, and I'll keep track of these questions. And I'll make the decision based on which questions need to be taken along the way and which ones are better off holding to the end. I'm sure, as usual, we'll run out of time before we run out of questions, but you're welcome to keep sending your questions, and we can also follow up. We would record this webinar as we are right now and make the document and the recording available at the end in a day or two after the webinar is done today. Okay, with that, let me introduce our speaker. Nikhil Deshpande is our featured speaker for this topic of responsive web design. Nikhil is a user experience strategist. He's a practitioner, which is always, we welcome practitioners to these webinar series. He's the director of Georgia Gov Interactive website, and also he teaches interaction design and social game design courses at Savannah College of Art and Design in Atlanta. With that, over to you, Nikhil.
All right, thanks, Hemant. Good afternoon, everyone. Please bear me as I'm recovering from a pretty bad allergies to pollen here. So, responsive web design. I mean, before diving into this topic, I want to, kind of have a couple of disclaimers. One of them primarily is that responsive is, as we all know or probably have heard, is relatively newer. Now, it's been at least 4 years that the concept has been introduced, but 4 years is still new for the fruition and the actual kind of bulletproof ideation and execution of this technology. But within the last 4 years, this concept has come a very long way. There are a bunch of people who have contributed to this, and without their contributions, obviously, I wouldn't be using this in my day-to-day work and also be talking about this. So before we kind of talk about responsive, I want to start out by where actually responsive came from and what was the need for responsive. So as we all know, that mobile devices are multiplying. They're taking over. Some of these stats now, they actually go back to 2012, end of 2012. I bet in 2013 these numbers have changed, just to kind of highlight that mobile devices are actually taking over. These are literally everyday stats, and as we can see in the last 3 or 4 years, within the developing countries and developed countries, mobile devices have been getting to be the primary source of how people access the web. Western Europe or Asia Pacific regions, literally now account 60% of the worldwide mobile data traffic, and this only kind of shows that it's only going to go up from here. This is a map where this is a terabyte per month map, and as you can see, the consumption for mobile compared to 2009 and 2014 is this exponential. In West Africa or even in India, mobile internet is pretty much kind of like a widely used as compared to like fixed line internet, and that's just mind blowing because
Nikhil,
people who
Nikhil,
actually
Nikhil, sorry to interrupt you. There's some kind of concern on your voice being a little low volume. So I don't know if you can move a little bit closer to your mic and speak more directly into it. That might help.
Okay. Is this better?
Yeah, this seems better for sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So as I was saying, in West Africa or in India, for example, there are, as per the early 2014 stats, there are like 100+ million Facebook users just alone in India. And closely about 75% of them are exclusively mobile users, which means like a lot of them just have not seen Facebook on a desktop device at all. So what does that really kind of say? One of the things to consider is that yes, mobile, at least in the U.S., is pretty much a norm now. Like we have almost everyone who kind of like has a mobile phone, but about 52% of just the laptop users who otherwise consider themselves as mobile computing users still use a smartphone. And it's just not just a smartphone, but it's also a smartphone that is always connected. So typically being like an iOS device or like an Android device. One of the kind of myth that is around smartphones, like typically when we design for smartphones, is that a user using a smartphone is always on the go. They're rushed, or they might not have a good connection compared to a Wi-Fi connection or a broadband connection. Google did a study in 2013 where they found out that most of the times that people use their smartphones are when they are home. Like an extensive, exclusive usage of smartphone. It is true that people use smartphones obviously when they're on go, but their consistent usage of a smartphone happens when they are in a covered area, typically their home, or when they're watching television. What that means is that typically a smartphone, if they're using at home, they are connected to a Wi-Fi device. So the whole broadband aspect of smartphone and designing for smartphones is not as much of a restriction, although it is always something that we need to be considering. Another stat, is that we don't just need to rely on someone having a smartphone. We are a multi-gadget, generation now. We have laptops, we have tablets, we have phones, and a lot of times, like, we have more than one phone. Like, personally, me, I have, like, my work phone, I have my personal phone, and then, just for the sake of testing, I have Android devices. So just if you take some power users, I know a lot of people who use, like, more than 5 devices. So having said that, the landscape is exponentially growing, and we don't know where it's going because we're always talking about variables. So without spending too much time on talking about, what the future of devices is going to be, something we know for a fact that whatever that is that we are using, it's always going to be connected. With 4G, 3G availability, not just on our devices, but also in our cars. The whole aspect of mobile and, the definition of mobile is changing. Now, how does that relate to responsive design? Well, as designers, which I am, it's a challenge for me to design something that I don't know how it's going to be used. Well, if it was like 6 or 7 years ago, I would just assume that someone's going to be using whatever I'm designing on a desktop or a decent laptop. But today, somebody just might be in a car trying to pull up something, trying to look for something that, you have to design. And it's our responsibility to make sure that, that particular, whatever that we are serving is actually doing justice to the device that the users are using. So this brings us to the concept of OneWeb. All right, so this is like a big thing in the user experience community, which is OneWeb for all things. What this really means is, our websites need to work everywhere. They need to adapt to their environment. We want to make sure that the content is easily available, it's readily, kind of accessible, And it doesn't matter how they use it. They could be using an iPhone and an Android device or a little netbook, tablet, regardless of which tablet, or they just could be using one of those fancy iMacs or like a huge 27 or 32-inch monitors. Still, whatever it is that we are serving, we need to be able to kind of cater to that particular device. So what does this mean from a technical perspective? What it means is, our technology, that whatever we are using to serve content, needs to be able to, use some sort of a feature detection, mostly, on the client side, to get a sense of what is the device. Now, it's pretty hard to actually kind of, sense devices now that truly devices could come in any shape and sizes. So what is the one thing that we saw earlier, that everything, is in common, every device has in common, is all of them have a screen. And if we have a screen on every device, that's pretty much the common thread of how we can actually start, at least designing and considering the variations. So responsive web design is mostly, a combination of multiple factors, technology, design, ideas that come together. What it lets you do is it allows you to use a single URL. It uses a single domain name of a site, and it takes away the need to design for a specific device out of the picture. That's what used to happen. We used to be designing for devices, for mobile devices, for desktop devices. Today, really, like we saw, there is no concept as mobile. Everything can be mobile. There are tablets that are 20-inch, big. What responsive design really kind of introduced was, we need to make web design future-proof. And because we just can't predict what's coming, right? So we can keep changing our web presence. So that's, kind of an answer to what we used to see, something like this, where, you had a mobile-specific site, and then you also had, a desktop site. A lot of people started, using mobile sites on desktops because, it had a very specific domain, and a lot of times you just kind of tend to forward URLs via email. So that was like a lot of mix and match. But the biggest issue here was that there was a duplication of effort. Mobile sites being its own entity, it had to be maintained separate from a desktop site. As you can see, there's a lot of content that's not actually duplicated on the mobile site. Now it's a different, discussion if those pictures and happy people need to be on a mobile site. But considering the fact that there is some loss of data, that is a significant point to kind of note that, when something goes mobile, in the past, things were actually being filtered down. So we needed something that could bridge the gap. And this is where responsive came in. But before we actually jump into kind of the, depths of responsive, let's also take a look at the concept of responsive. Responsive web design, although it was coined about 4 years ago, it's actually not, a concept that's just 4 years old. We had responsive design. Essentially, what is responsive design, right? I mean, it's design that responds. So let's take a look at this. I don't know if any of you still remember this. This was Amazon's website when they launched. This was back in 1995. And this site was responsive, believe it or not, because it didn't really matter what size screen you were using, but when you actually pulled the browser window, it shifted the text and it adjusted the line length. Otherwise, the text just went on and on all through the screen width. I have an example here that I can feature, like on some of the sites, even today, where we still see some, kind of the old school fluid layouts, as we call them, where, for example, something like this that stretches all the way through the width of the window. If you take this and if you start moving this in, things automatically adjust. And as you can see, things just, at some point, kind of start wrapping around like in this table here. But this is this is actually just an example of what it used to be. Now, we didn't have to do all the extra coding to make this responsive, but this is a browser, native browser property. So, how did responsive actually go from here? The change that happened here was that because everything was so fluid, as a designer, we had to put some structure around it. And it's not just, something that is specific to designers. Everybody has some sort of, yes.
Because there's some complaints from the audience about sound fading in and out, so I don't know if there's anything in your control to keep the microphone more closer or do anything, but just FYI, there's some issue with sound.
Okay. I was using earlier a headset, which I took it off, and now I'm just like literally holding my phone in my hand. But I'll
keep going. I'll keep going.
I would try and keep it.
All right.
Okay. So the layout aspect of this is that we needed to kind of, put everything in a structure, put everything in an order. And this is where we started as, designers and developers started using tables where we gave the browser a certain width and we inserted our content. Even though the content was fluid, we, set the table width to be something that was fixed. So as you can see on the left-hand side here, the 960 pixel, it's a fixed table width. And the designers and developers had to work with it. But using tables was just a bad idea, right? I mean, for all of you people who are aware of the accessibility concerns of using tables and also the complexity of the code, it just added, way too much code. It was very complex to, kind of manage and modify pages. So again, that was just a break fix solution, but that was not a future-proof solution. But thankfully, to our, kind of rescue, we had the introduction of cascading style sheets, which helped us with way less code achieve the same layout and the, sort of similar control that we had around, code. But another thing that, kind of the CSS, again, was limited was that it did give us a different way of presenting, but at the same time, it didn't really give us an option from the fixed layout. If you were to still do, sort of a 960 pixel fixed, if you do like a 90% relative width, it still would like span all across, the 27-inch monitors. So there was still, some way of, kind of control that we needed to hold on to, because when we did things fluid, they just went way, way out of our control. One other thing that, kind of contributed to this fact was the monitors didn't really change. Or when I say the monitors, the actual screen sizes. We either went from, 800 by 600 to maybe going forward, something that was 1024 by 768 or 1200 going forward. But still, I mean, the variation between them was not that much, which drastically changed, when these tablets and when handheld devices were considered when introduced in the market. The other aspect of this was how did we adapt from a design perspective? It's not just about the technical aspects of being able to, design or being able to display something, but how does this affect our design? Clearly, every time there's new technology, there is a certain, learning curve. So the same thing that happened going from print to digital, that we were just trying to emulate our print designs on the digital screens. Same thing happened with handheld devices. We were just trying to take our digital properties, the way they looked on the screen, and just make them show up the way they were on, our handheld devices. But going forward, what happened, a good thing that happened here, that handheld devices really got defined by, two early trailblazers. One was the iPad, and the other one was the iPhone that was launched. No, we actually got, a truncated version of what our screen experience was. We actually had to learn how to use it, right? We had to pinch in, zoom in, and then, just kind of move around the screen. As much as, the usability aspects were a concern up there, but at least we were able to get to, what was now something in your hands available. So we were still looking for that perfect solution of what could be possible. And, it actually got in front of us through just one simple article, which was written by a person called Ethan Marcotte. This is the first time the concept of responsive web design it was introduced. Ethan Marcotte put down, his thoughts about, well, this is what I know from a technical aspect, and this is how we can actually make things different with a combination of certain components. We can change the layout to fit, a certain size of a device, a viewport. A viewport is essentially, the part of the screen that displays your web properties. So being able to determine that, this article, really caught fire. Everyone was just kind of, gravitated towards this concept, and it's out there today. And then maybe later, I can share all the resources that I'm showing you. Maybe I can tweet all those resources. But this is a responsive web design article on a website called A List Apart. And as you can see, this is where he demonstrated how responsive design can work. So this is the article, and as you can see, if we change the screen, things change. Even the illustration, the way people are standing are different from here, and as you keep moving, it keeps changing. And that's exactly what his idea was, that as your screen changes, your website or your content needs to adapt to it and not just scale it like the iPhone used to do it. So going back to our presentation, I would absolutely recommend reading this article, and if this is something that you truly find interesting, Ethan also has an entire book on responsive web design, which, honestly, if you truly want to do a deeper dive in responsive web design, you need to read both of these. But anyway, for me to distill this concept, let's look at some of the components of responsive web design that Ethan, put across in that article and in his book. So the first thing that Ethan mentioned was, look, we need a certain grid system, which he mentioned as fluid grid. Grids need to change. Up till now, we have only known grids that create structure, give us some sort of consistency. But once we switch devices, that grid needs to adapt to that device. So he introduced this concept of a fluid grid. The next thing he introduced was flexible media, which we just saw an example of when I changed that browser width, how the illustration changed. So our media needs to adapt to what our screen size is and be seen accordingly. The next important component of what Ethan considered as a very core component of responsive is what he called as media queries. Well, he didn't really name it. Media queries always existed in CSS, but he highlighted them of this is why we need to be using media queries. And I'll be speaking to essentially all three of these as we go forward. But just to kind of give you an idea of what media queries do is that media queries are essentially the actual code within a style sheet that is looking at what the screen or a certain dimension change that happens. And when that change happens, these media queries point to a separate set of style sheets within your CSS that say, okay, now if this screen is this wide, then now we should be looking at these styles to render the content. Now this is, this whole conversation is assuming you have like a high-level idea of, how web pages work. So in your HTML, you have the structure of your page, right? I mean, you have something that defines your title, something that defines your paragraph. But with CSS, that content is actually styled. That layout is actually, kind of implemented in your cascading style sheets. So jumping forward to kind of highlighting what the fluid grid system does for you. Grids essentially, kind of give you structure, consistency, some sort of predictability, and they define the relationship between your pages. We all have been to web pages that, even though it's one side, one page doesn't look like the other. In that case, you kind of, start doubting the credibility of the website. So what grids do for you is, they kind of like, put things in order. At some point, they do create like some sort of constraints, but at the same time, it allows, the user to kind of have some sort of predictability, some sort of consistency. But what Ethan did was he predicted that this grid system can be made flexible for different screen sizes. So in this case, if the screen is of this particular width, you can have this layout, but the same grid system can be tweaked a bit if the screen is of this particular width. And same thing with, something that happens on the phone. So this by itself, is a good start, but we need the rest of the elements to actually act with it. Right? So we saw that the text actually aligns itself, which is a native property of every browser, but we needed, the rest of the media to actually, also work with it. Now, in the world of, kind of web design, I should say, flexible media, flexible images, it's a little thorny issue. It's still being debated because there's a tie to, kind of performance when it comes to images. Because a lot of times what happens is you have multiple ways that you can actually do this. You can choose to scale an image from something that is huge. For example, I can take like an image that's on the extreme right that we are seeing, something that fits our laptop screen. All right, so an image that's like 1140 by 960 pixels. So let's say that image size is 500K. Now, if I use the exact same image and to scale it down to my smartphone, which is, probably from an image size perspective, I need about 320 pixels by, 200 pixels or, whatever, if it's scaled down diagonally. First, I will probably lose part of my image details because my laptop image is horizontal. My mobile screen is vertical. Secondly, if I just scale down the same image, I'm going to be having to render a 500K image, which is meant for my laptop, maybe a broadband connection, on my mobile phone. Now, okay, I did talk about mobile phones now being connected to Wi-Fi, but that is one of the use cases. But there are instances where mobile phones are on their own, obviously. That's what makes it mobile. So we don't want to be using the same image, for multiple devices. And this is where flexible image is the concept of, creating different images for different screen sizes and changing that editorial content comes in, right? And this is where, media queries again kind of come in, where media queries can say, well, change this particular image based on, a particular size of the screen. Media queries typically deal with background images, but there are many ways where now the responsive community is trying to figure out what's the best way to treat images as content for responsive. There is this entire responsive images community group, and they have a website, and they always keep experimenting and coming up with like new solutions. So the picture element, is surely something that we should be considering when we talk about responsive. There are many ways that this is today done in a very efficient way. So if you're part of a conversation where there are some concerns about images being used in responsive design, a lot of times in my experience, what I've seen is a lot of people, kind of like probably don't have the entire picture of what it truly takes to kind of make something not just responsive, but also optimal. But nothing of this can actually happen, without using our really futuristic technology. Excuse me. Responsive, although it doesn't truly need HTML5 syntax, it is very, very, kind of helpful to use HTML5 from a technical perspective. There is surely an expectation from a standards viewpoint that somebody as a front-end developer or a designer should really know HTML5. So if your web property at this point is not using HTML5, you should be aware of that, because going forward, HTML5 is going to be the norm, and especially now that we know that Adobe Flash is kind of pretty much getting sunsetted from the production value of it. It is still probably used extensively for mockups, but a lot of our rich media interaction that used to hinge on Flash being able to deliver it now is all moving to HTML5. If you see all the Google illustrations and their daily animations on Google's website, they're all done in HTML5. So HTML5 has some really, really good advantages. The first advantage is that it comes up with its own new defined tags. HTML5 gives you that structure for a page that in the previous versions of HTML, we had to create our own structure, and we had to name our own structure. HTML5 took away that that vagueness out of coding, and now they gave us these tags that just make sense, like a header tag, a footer tag, a navigation tag, right? A video tag. Earlier, if you were to show video on your website, you would have to resort to Flash or resort to some other middleware to kind of render that on the client side. But with HTML5, you just point to the video source and it just renders it. What HTML5 really brings along with this is it has a better semantic value, because when HTML5 was architected, these names, these tag names to these new elements, they weren't just made up, obviously. There was a big community of these professional designers, developers who came together and they exchanged notes. Like when I develop something, what is it that I use? So hey, if you and all of us use a header tag, why not actually have that in HTML where it just becomes a standard? So there's a lot of semantic value of using HTML for the best tag getting the job done. Another aspect that it actually kind of as the better semantics put out in place, what it helps us is there's a more organized code that comes with it, and this is very important when it comes to responsive. Responsive, because it's so code driven, you have to have a really very organized code. And I'm a designer, and I'm also a front-end developer, and a lot of times I've been in positions where I have to work on something that is developed by somebody else, and it took me a lot of time just to understand what they're trying to do, just to interpret that code. But with HTML5, because the tags are now all standardized, it's much easier to read and understand. The other benefit of HTML5 is accessibility. The syntax, HTML5 syntax, because it creates such a meaningful document outline, it automatically enhances the accessibility aspect of your page, especially with devices that kind of use screen readers. Lastly but not the least, and this is something that is so near to heart for everyone, is search engine optimization. HTML5 improves your SEO because search engines love things that are categorized, things that are in order, things that give your content weight and preference. The tags and the overall semantic aspects of it, really kind of help that. But there are also a few things that we really need to understand with HTML5. The main issue with that is, the browser support. Most of the older browsers that don't support HTML5. And when I say most of the older browsers, I'm primarily talking about Internet Explorer. IE 9 and 10, they do, but if you look at the overall footprint of IE 9 and 10, it's still significantly lower compared to the previous versions of IE. Most of the other browsers, like the Chromes and the Firefoxes, they support HTML5, from a lot of their previous versions. There are many tools out there that can check and that can help you, kind of see if a certain aspect of your site is supported. But if there is something that is not supported, there is a concept called shims, where we can put in place these hacks where if hey IE8, if you can render this, no problem. You can just pretty much emulate this particular thing that we're trying to do here. So there are ways to kind of go around that as well. But the thing that actually makes this happen is CSS3. Now CSS3, it has quite a similar history to HTML5, right? I mean, it has like a lot of great features. It has a lot of things that it can do. But again, going back to, can browsers support it? One of the biggest feature, other than the stress on media queries, and we're going to be talking about media queries separate, so I'm just highlighting some of the other features, is I love this whole fallback option that has in CSS3. For example, like you can now use any kinds of fonts in CSS3. We were restricted to font usage, and then somehow there were web fonts that were being made available by Google, but you can actually choose what fonts you want. And if something needs to be rendered on a phone, you probably don't want a font that takes a long time to render. You probably want a font that is easier to render. So you can actually switch fonts using CSS3. And there is fallback, where, for example, like I was talking earlier, where, hey, is HTML5 not being able to play video because the browser doesn't recognize the video tag? No problem. We can just come up with a fallback option for, Flash to render it. Talked about like how we can embed fonts. That's something that CSS can do for us. They can actually use licensed web fonts. It can be local or it can be remote, and all we have to do is like use a font face reference in our style sheet, and we can use whatever that is that we aspire to. And I can tell you, as a designer or a front-end developer, what a huge benefit that is just from a usability perspective. There are many other features like polyfills, like the HTML5 shim that I was talking about. It allows you to use HTML5 elements in your code in the previous versions of IE and render them. So you're not actually missing out on features. You're providing support for your older. So the point being here is like, don't let the fact that older browsers don't support responsive stop you from doing the responsive, because again, we are not doing this for computers who are using IE6. We're using this for the phones. We're using this for the tablets. Anyway, Microsoft themselves are actually trying to get rid of IE6, and they're trying to kind of reduce the overall footprint. The next aspect is media queries. And there's a really good resource up here. It's called Media Queries, and I can share this again with you. And this lists out, all some of the really good responsive sites that use media queries. One of the examples that I would really like to show you, which I feel it's a very good example, is the worldwildlife.org website. This is a website. They have done such a good job with the responsive. As you can see, I start moving this, and just like we saw in Ethan's article, the images change from a four column. Now they're going to go. Notice our navigation changed. Earlier we had navigation. Now they just kind of kept what was absolutely premium. What was important was donate, adopt. And as you kind of go down, this just adapts to what the screen size is. And this is exactly what you need in your website, because if someone's using a phone for the first time to look what you have on your website, you don't want to lose them because you just didn't really plan for them to be using their phone. So what media queries do is they're all about conditions, right? So what I mean by that is, like, you use media query, a media type, or the expressions to check for a certain condition. So this condition could be anything. This could be, hey, what screen size they are using, which is typically used in the media queries. So it would create a certain condition that, well, if this is a certain screen size. Now we use screen sizes because devices tend to use fixed resolutions, right? So at this point, you can't really resize a web browser on your phones, at least not right now. So what it gives us is, like, well, it gives us at least like a good starting point to understand where the users are coming from, and then accordingly point them to a certain media query. Now, I don't want to get too much in the weeds of the technical aspects of it, but this is just an example of what a media query looks like. This is kind of like the title of a media query, where here it says the media type being the screen and the maximum device width being 480 pixels. What it tells the style is that, well, if your screen is anything that's under 480 pixels, use this particular style sheet. Now, what this 480 pixel otherwise is known as is a breakpoint. A breakpoint is a point where if you don't adapt your layout, it breaks going forward. So this is what media queries do for you. The next
Nikhil, let's take one quick question on the media queries. Does media queries also support other display or media attributes, like, say, availability of a touch sense on screen, aside from the size?
Repeat that question, Hemant, again.
So does media queries also support things other than size of the display device? So, for example, touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not so much touch, but media queries, can also point to a lot of other things, not just the screen. For example, you can have a media query to sense if someone is trying to print a page.
Okay.
So in that case, what media query does is it understands that someone is trying to print the page, and then it just switches to a style sheet if we actually have something that is a print-friendly style sheet. There are so many media queries, and media queries, again, is not very, not a CSS3 issue. It actually was back in CSS2 as well, but now with CSS3 having this screen width aspect to it, actually has been used prominently.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So moving on, from a usability perspective, if our design has to change, it has to actually also, consider some of the actual native aspects of it, right? In this case, navigation. Navigation is always hard. Navigation is a challenge because users kind of don't, move to look for navigation unless they're absolutely lost. Lately, we've seen that people just love to just search things, but that also, has a huge dependency on how well your search is. Navigation, obviously it has to be something that is clear, usable, also, kind of affordable from a sense of affordance. Well, it needs to look like a navigation. But what happens when, navigation changes from something that's supposed to be on desktop to something like this, where it goes down to a tablet, down to maybe a tablet that's vertical, or something all the way down to, a phone? So there are multiple ways that we can actually treat navigation. One is, depending on how much time and budget you want to spend, you can quickly style navigation to just stack up like this. On the left is a typical desktop site. On the right, this is what navigation looks on the phone. This is a lightweight solution, obviously, because what the media queries do is they just point to styles that just stack these links. It's pretty easy to do from a styling perspective. What it does is it eats up your space, right? Because right now you have 6 links, but If you have like 10 or 15, that's not going to be a good thing. So in other cases, you might have to resort to some other, kind of strategies where, well, yeah, it takes a little more time to develop it, but this is like a menu where unless you touch that menu button, which most of us have seen now being implemented, it doesn't actually, show us what the menu is. For this, we need to understand how users, also use the phone. We know that, about 75% of our users, use their thumb now to start actually browse their phones. As the device diversity increases, I mean, honestly, the way we interact with our phone, essentially the way we interact with web is going to change. So it's not just about, understanding how to make things change and make things happen. We also have to constantly keep up with the user aspect of it. For example, for this to happen, we need to understand the touch aspect of it, right? So if we just kind of, one of the things that we can't really use the touch assumption because now tablets that use a larger browser are also touch enabled. So if there was like a media query that only sensed that, if touch is the criteria and render it this way, for a tablet, like a Sony tablet that is like a 22-inch tablet, it still will be confusing because it will probably render something that, looks like a phone, but then it's not used like a phone. So in this case, if a quick look at, the touch aspect of it is that we need to understand that when we use a finger as compared to a mouse or a pointer, we have to obviously consider the fact that there are going to be, some errors with otherwise we call it like the fat finger, right? Because Apple and Microsoft, they have done some extensive research, and Apple recommends a target size of about 44 by 44 pixels for a touch target. I mean, later they kind of also, when they introduced Retina display, they kind of changed it to a points aspect, which is, I think, about 326 points per inches. Microsoft kind of also suggests that, well, maybe, you could do this around 9 millimeter by 9 millimeter. They kind of, introduced like a physical aspect of width in it, as instead of relying on pixels or points because the screen densities vary. So we see that, okay, if our target is should be about 9 millimeter wide, and maybe, between two targets we need at least, 2 millimeter distance so that we don't end up, kind of using our finger in the wrong place. This changes our design as well, right? So it's not just about adapting one design to the other. It truly needs to, have its own way of thought. And this is where the mobile-first approach comes in. Earlier, when the responsive, bandwagon was kind of getting filled with early adopters, people were moving back from their desktop design sites to a tablet site to a mobile site. And then they saw that there were like a lot of problems because they were not doing it the right way. So what they did was a lot of them redesigned their sites, now going mobile first. They first designed for mobile, then for tablet, and then for desktop, because that's really where the users are coming from. So, while we are doing this, one of the good things about responsive is that it takes away from the whole, waterfall mindset of you need to first, do mock-ups, and you need to first do prototypes, and then you develop them, and then you, deploy them, test them. This is an iterative process. So you need to constantly test, and you need to kind of develop real time.
Nikhil, before you go to the next page, in the page there where you're just showing transition to mobile first, can you give an example of an alternative design that one would do if they did not do mobile first versus if they did in the top half of the page where you say if you did it for desktop first and then made it work on mobile versus if you did it mobile first? Is there an example you can use to illustrate this difference?
There is. Actually, let me see if I have it open. There is a website called HappyCog. And what they did was they literally spent one weekend in redesigning their entire site, because what they had done in the past was, and this is the new design, and what they had done in the past was they actually went back from their existing design to make it mobile, and then they realized that they really needed to kind of like change strategies. But you can see a really good other example would be Boston Globe, where this is where what bostonglobe.com used to look like. It still looks just like that, but unlike New York Times, now if you move this, and this is a heavy content website. Notice how the columns change, and as you kind of move down again, the navigation changes, and this becomes truly responsive. So this is an example where they actually kind of held on to their look and feel of what their site used to look like, but they made the rest of their site responsive for mobile devices. I believe that no, I think I used
the New York Times. I think
New York Times. Yeah. My left-hand typings. There we go. So the last I had checked New York Times, it's a very similar layout, but last I had checked, they're still not responsive. So this is what the users, kind of have to deal with, is a scaled down version of their site compared to the Boston Globe. And this is a huge, usability problem. So does that answer your question, Hemant?
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Okay. So to kind of make sure that you are on the right path, you really have to test it. You have to test essentially the responsive aspects of it. The responsive aspect being kind of the viewpoints or the breakpoint testing. The section of every device differs. There are some testing tools that can help you. This is a tool that I use. This is called Screenfly. It's by this service called Quark Tools. And if we just put in, for example, let's say Boston Globe in here, it actually gives us what the site will look like. Oh. All right. So, okay, maybe I fat fingered it. BostonGlobe.com. There we go. I was like, yeah, perfect time for the tool to just break. So this is, you can toggle. This is what, the tablet, say, Kindle Fire will render it for you. So, yeah, this is a good place to start. But I wouldn't completely rely on an online tool to do this. What you really need to do is make sure you use actual device testing. Through your analytics, look up what devices are being used to access your website, and then come up with that particular device list. This is a website, Dan Olson, who is a huge thought leader in this area. He lists out this is at least the devices that you need to have to check your websites. And again, I will be sharing these resources later with him. Going forward, another thing you could actually rely on that, again, is a really foolproof way of doing it, is Adobe's, software tool, Inspect. What they do is they let you connect all these devices together, and so you can just use your laptop to browse a certain site, and then all the rest of the devices actually, kind of show you the exact same thing, what you're using your laptop for. So you don't have to, spend, and this is if you don't want to spend time testing 25 different devices, if you just have one or two people testing it. So this is a really good tool. The last but not the least is, make sure you optimize your website. There are tools out there that validate your HTML code, that validate your CSS code, but treat your performance. And I believe Scott Jill had talked about this in the past, where treat your performance as a milestone in your design process, because without performance, your responsive investment is nothing. And this is where really some of the bad responsive examples kind of give responsive a bad rep, because they don't do performance testing. And kind of like your household budget, you really have to kind of put a certain budget on your responsive. And I'm not saying budget as far as how much you spend on your optimization, but how much content can you allow for a certain page, based on if you have mobile usage that are using actual 4G or 3G, then kind of limit your page to a certain maybe 100K or 200K, whatever that is. For your desktop usage, limit it to 500K. So fix your budget on things. There are some really good again tools. There's a website called yslow.org, like the Y as in Yahoo, slow.org, that helps you with giving you a performance health check for your website. Brad Frost is a huge name when it comes to performance testing. He has a book called Performance as Design. I think it's a very, very important thing to kind of keep in mind is, I mean, we do load testing for everything else, but especially for responsive, you need to test what the performance looks like and if it's optimized to actually deliver that responsive. So having said that, this is pretty much kind of like an overview that I could kind of distill the whole responsive design process for you.
Excellent. Thanks, Nikhil. This is good. So I think now this is time for us to take questions. And audience, I already have a few questions here, and I'll encourage you guys, if you have any other burning questions based on the content that Nikhil just covered, we'll take those. We have a few more minutes. And Nikhil, if you can advance to next page, I can do in the meantime, a quick introduction to Synerzip while I'm collecting the questions. So Synerzip, for those of you who are new to us in this webinar series, we are a product development partner, and emphasis is on partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We help these companies, and Nikhil, you can probably build this whole page out so I can quickly cover the highlights. So for each of these client companies, which are small to mid-sized software companies, we help them put together a dedicated team of software professionals and really deliver software following agile practices and help them not only reduce costs but also reduce the risk of software development. We have a development center in India, and we are able to provide a significant, typically 50% cost advantage, and at the same time provide flexibility also, so our clients can convert the team to a captive operation wherever they feel like it. So that's kind of a quick introduction to Synerzip. You're welcome to reach out to us if we can help. And Nikhil, if you can move to next. This is just a glimpse of some of our clients. So let's go to the next page and kind of tee up the questions now. So Nikhil, if you're ready, let's take at least a few questions in the remaining minutes. So the first one is, if you can, we went through this responsive web design. Can you contrast this with the need, some cases, to really build a native mobile app? In some cases, companies may feel like they need to have a separate mobile app versus just have a responsive web design that allows their content to be displayed properly on a mobile device. Any idea, any suggestions how
Sure.
People should think about that?
Sure. Yeah, actually, it's a really good question, because it's a different litmus test. There is a decision that needs to be made between, should I go responsive or should I go native? Now, this typically comes when you kind of are talking about application, a certain transaction that needs to happen. Responsive, surely gives you that benefit of having like one central location. So with native apps, kind of what you have to do is, if you truly need a native app, you have to first kind of know why you need a native app. Do you want to use any, device-specific features like the camera, or the overall GPS, or kind of like the whole accelerometer aspect of your phone. I mean, for whatever that that app actually features, which is not offered on the responsive side of it. But that truly qualifies you to kind of have your native app per se. So if that's the criteria, then surely have a native app. Native app typically is not a solution or a replacement for a website. Responsive is something that you apply towards your web presence or something that you do on the web. It could be an application, that's fine, but it's still, if it has a web presence, then you're looking at a cost-effective solution, because for a native app, for example, if you were to have it, you at least want to have it for iOS or for Android or maybe for a Windows phone now, if not for a BlackBerry. But then you're still looking at like keeping up with like 3 different platforms here. But with responsive, regardless of your device, it's device agnostic. So you just have to kind of keep up with like one code base, and it just renders based on whatever the device you're using. So kind of a little different, but at the same time, it's something that if you don't need any of the device-specific features, then by all means, responsive is your friend.
Okay, excellent. I'll take one other question, and maybe we can just evolve this into a comment since we are out of time. So the question was, what is a good site or approach to start learning HTML5 and CSS3 for experienced and inexperienced web designers? So I was going to request you, Nikhil, maybe you get that question about and other resources that you pointed along the way that are useful for testing or for as good best practices example for responsive design. Maybe we can add a page or 2 in this PowerPoint before we put it up on our website.
Yeah.
People have access to this.
Right. I mean, there's so many of them. So yeah, what we can do is I can actually give you some of the resources that are kind of really good resources for maybe non-technical people to just understand about this technology, and also somebody who is just starting out, where they can start from.
Excellent. Sounds good. So we look forward to that, and thank you so much. We could have taken a few more questions if we had the time, but this is always a challenge for us. But I really appreciate, Nikhil, you sharing this in-depth perspective on responsive web design, and thanks to all the audience for attending, and stay tuned for next webinar in this series.
Sure thing. Thanks.
Thank you.